This is the highest place on Earth, the summit of Everest, where the air runs out and the living do not belong. In 1953, the world celebrated the first men to stand here. But a question has haunted this mountain for 100 years, because two men may have reached this summit 29 years before, and only the mountain knows for sure. A century ago, Everest was the last great problem on Earth. The poles had been reached. This was the third pole, unconquered, unforgiving, and one man's name had become bound to it, George Mallory. When a reporter asked why he wished to climb it, he gave the most famous answer in the history of adventure. Because, he said, it is there. To understand what he risked and what he left behind, we go back to 1924. Mallory had been here before. In 1922, on an earlier attempt, the British had pushed high onto the mountain, and the mountain had answered. An avalanche swept the slopes, and 7 porters were lost in an instant, buried in the ice. Mallory never forgot them. He knew, better than anyone, what this mountain could ask. And still, he chose to return. But George Mallory was not only a climber. In a sunlit house in England, he had a wife, Ruth, and 3 young children. They were the great love of his life. He wrote to her constantly, tender letters across the miles. And each time the mountain called him away, it was Ruth who stayed behind and waited. Before he left for the last time, George made Ruth a promise. He carried with him a small photograph of her face, tucked safe against the cold. And he vowed that if he reached the top of the world, he would place her picture there, so that she too would stand on the summit. Remember that photograph. It matters more than you know. And George did not climb alone. At his side was a young man named Sandy Irvine, just 22 years old. Not a seasoned mountaineer, but an Oxford athlete, strong, brilliant with his hands. It was Irvine who nursed their fragile oxygen sets, rebuilding them in the freezing cold with a boy's genius. George chose him for his strength, his spirit, and the quiet devotion between them. The mountain's great enemy was the air itself, so thin near the summit that a man's mind slows, his body fails, his judgment dies. Their answer was bottled oxygen, heavy, unreliable, and controversial. On these crude steel cylinders, carried into the death zone, the whole attempt would live or die. Everything now depended on Irvine's machines and on the weather. And so they climbed, by ship, by foot, across the roof of the world, and then up, into the death zone, higher than almost any human had ever stood. Wool and leather and crude bottled air, George Mallory and Sandy Irvine pushed toward the summit, toward the unknown, toward the place where the photograph was meant to rest. On the 8th of June, 1924, a teammate far below looked up, and the clouds parted. High on the summit ridge, he saw them, 2 tiny black spots, moving steadily upward, climbing strong toward the top. And then, the cloud closed over the mountain like a curtain. And George Mallory and Sandy Irvine were never seen alive again. Were they going up or coming down? No one would ever know. Far away in the English summer, Ruth did not yet know. On that very day, she was at the seaside with the children, the sun on the water, waiting for news of her husband's triumph. She still believed he was coming home. She still believed the photograph would be standing on the summit. She did not know that the mountain had already taken him. Then the telegram came. A few cold words carried across the world. Mallory and Irvine, lost on Everest. In a quiet English room, the waiting ended, and the grief began. The man who had climbed so close to heaven was gone, and Ruth was left with his letters, his children, and a question that would never be answered. He had no wife, no children yet, only a future that simply stopped. Two men lost on one rope, two families staring at the same impossible question, and a mountain that would keep its silence for 75 years. And so began the silence. Years passed, then decades. In 1953, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay reached the summit and returned alive, and the world had its first confirmed conquerors. But the question only deepened. Had Mallory been there first? Ruth never knew. She lived out her years, carried the not knowing, and died in 1942, with the mystery still sealed inside the mountain. But the mountain does not forget. Where the rest of the world decays and moves on, Everest holds its dead in perfect frozen stillness. In that cold, time does not pass. The snow that fell on two climbers in 1924 lay over them, unbroken, year after year, decade after decade, keeping them exactly as the mountain had taken them, waiting.
And 75 years after they vanished, then a team set out to solve the mystery once and for all. They climbed to the height where the two men were lost, searching the ice for any trace, searching a pack, a camera.
For 3/4 of a century, Everest had given nothing back, but the searchers believed the mountain was still holding its secret, somewhere in the snow. And then, on the 1st of May 1999, they found him. High on the mountain, frozen into the slope, lay the body of a climber, preserved by 75 years of ice. The clothing of another age. The name G. Mallory still stitched into the collar. After 3/4 of a century, George Mallory had been found at last. Among his belongings, the searchers found pieces of a life frozen in time. Letters still legible. His snow goggles tucked in a pocket, a clue that he may have been climbing in the dark. But one thing was missing: the photograph of Ruth, the picture he had carried up a mountain, the one he swore to place upon the summit, was not on his body. It was gone. And there was only one place it could be. If the photograph was not on him, then perhaps he carried it higher still. Perhaps, in the thin and freezing air, George Mallory reached the summit of the world 29 years before history records it, and kept his promise. Perhaps Ruth's face has rested on the roof of the earth for 100 years, watching over the mountain that took him. We cannot prove it, but we are allowed to imagine it. And the mountain was not finished. In 2024, 100 years after the two men vanished, a single boot melted out of the ice on the glacier below. Inside, a sock, embroidered with a name, A.C. Irvine. The young climber, just 22 when he was lost, had finally begun to come down the mountain, piece by piece, across a century. We do not know if George Mallory reached the summit, but we know how he felt as he climbed toward it. In his last letter home, written to Ruth from the mountain, he wrote, "It is 50-1 against us, but we'll have a whack yet and do ourselves proud." He never came home to her. But 100 years later, his words still carry the love and the courage of a man climbing toward the sky. Ruth kept his letters all her life. The mountain made him immortal. But it was Ruth who paid the price for the legend, quietly, at home, with 3 children and an empty chair. Somewhere on that mountain, perhaps, a small camera still lies frozen in the snow, holding the final answer in a single undeveloped frame. And somewhere, perhaps, on the highest point on Earth, a photograph of Ruth has watched over the world for 100 years.
George Mallory carried the woman he loved to the top of the world. Whether he placed her there, we may never know. But the carrying was the whole of it, because the surface is never the whole story. And what endures is love.
If this stayed with you, follow my channel, because the surface is never the whole story. There's a new story every time. Please subscribe.